Hello. Thank you everybody for joining us today. We are so happy to have you here for the Mad Women of Hillsborough. As many of you know, this was part of our year-long celebration of She Changed the World. And though we couldn't do it exactly like we planned, we are happy to be able to do it in some way, shape, or form. So it is my pleasure as the historical coordinator here to introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Sylvia Hoffert, who is a distinguished professor of history and women's studies from UNC. Most recently, she served as a professor of history at Texas A&M University. She is also a member of the Historic Hillsborough Commission and a very valued member at that. She has been particularly helpful as we look to site interpretation here, so we are very thankful for all of the support she gives us, in addition to being willing to do this presentation today. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce my friend, Sylvia Hoffert, to come and speak. Thank you.
Thank you for that nice introduction. So what we're going to talk about today is the treatment of mental illness in the 19th century. And what I'd like to do is to give you just a general context in which these women were suffering from mental illness. And then I've got 4 women that I'd like to talk to you about. So that's kind of how we're going to proceed. So first of all, when you think of medicine in the 19th century, you have to think all male doctors. There were no female doctors, especially in the early part of the 19th century. There were no specialties. Everybody was a general practitioner. There were no specialties. There was no gynecology. There was no psychiatry. Doctors were either not trained at all, or they trained under another doctor. And the most elite among them trained in medical schools. And there were 2 kinds of medical schools. One kind wasn't very good, and the other kind was, the 3 that were really good were located in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. What was interesting about Hillsborough is that many of their doctors either trained in Philadelphia or they trained under Dr. Webb, who was kind of a mentor to the medical community here in Hillsborough. So what we had in Hillsborough was exceptional. You have to remember that there was no licensing. So if you decided you wanted to be a doctor, you rented a space or you put a shingle outside your house and said, doctor. And if people were silly enough to come to you, then you could practice medicine. But in any case, that's kind of the situation that existed when these women became ill. The other thing you need to understand is that the South was not a particularly healthy place. There were endemic diseases natural to this location, such as dysentery and malaria, which became extremely debilitating. And then there were epidemics. So there were smallpox epidemics, yellow fever epidemics, and cholera. Cholera is typical of a larger town than Hillsborough, but nevertheless, those kinds of diseases, everybody knew about them. Everybody knew that there was nothing you could do about them. They were completely clueless as to how to treat them successfully. So it was not a really very healthy place to be to begin with. And then we need to talk a little bit about medical treatment. In the early 19th century, they practiced what they called heroic medicine. If you got sick, they would bleed you. That was done in one of 2 ways. They slit a vein and held your arm over a basin until your blood flowed out, until they decided that that was enough. They had no idea how much was enough, but until it was enough. Or they would put leeches on your veins, and they would, of course, suck the blood, and then when they got satiated, they would fall off. So that was bleeding. Then they had purging, anything that would make you throw up. They believed that you had to get inside your body was something that was bad, and you needed to get rid of it. They also blistered you. So you put a hot iron or something on you and blistered you. But the most important thing for our purposes is that there was an extensive use of opium and its derivatives, so opiates. It was believed to cure everything, cancer, common cold, whatever. Doctors used it all the time. It was easily available. You could get it through mail order. You could get it in the local pharmacy, local dry goods store. You could make it yourself. There was a story during the Civil War when her supply of opium got cut off by the war, the president of UNC's daughter simply grew poppies in her garden and took the poppies and made her own opium. So it was widely used by many people, and it was used anytime anybody got sick. Now you know where this is going, right? So if people are using it all the time, what we're going to have is a problem with addiction. Okay. The second thing we need to know about is attitudes towards women's mental health. The assumption on the part of doctors was that women's bodies were weak, that their minds were even weaker, that their emotional life was tied to the reproductive organs. So if they were exhibiting any kind of mental problems, it probably had something to do with their uterus, and that they were basically unstable. Now, the definition of unstable is an interesting one because it really meant if they weren't conforming to social conventions, then it was likely that their lack of attention to those conventions was due to some sort of mental illness, which you could expect from them anyway because they were basically unstable. All right, so that's the basic background. The second thing we need to know about is mental asylums. And I have very little to say about that, except that in the 17th and 18th century, if you were so disturbed that you needed to be taken out of your home and put somewhere, there were asylums. The one I know the most about is the one in Williamsburg, Virginia. And if you go to Williamsburg, Virginia, they have a room set up with an 18th century model and a room set up with a 19th century model. The 18th century model shows a bare room, pallet on the floors, dirty straw, manacles, so you could chain somebody to the wall, bars in the windows, and basically the treatment of the mentally ill was to throw them in a cell like that and just forget they existed. So they were abused, they were neglected, and most people never got out of an insane asylum there. So the Williamsburg Insane Asylum kept most of its patients. There was never the thought that they could be cured of anything. What happened in the early 19th century was the attitudes changed, and it changed to something that was called the moral treatment. And the moral treatment was based on the assumption that A, you could cure mental illness, and that you did it by removing the mentally ill from whatever environment it was that made them go crazy in the first place. So if you go to Williamsburg, you'll see a second room across the hall from the first room, and that room will show a quite spare, but quite clean and neat room with a bed and a table and a writing table and a chair. And I can't remember if there are bars still on the windows, but the idea was that what you wanted to do was to take them away from whatever was irritating their psyche, and you wanted to put them in an environment where they could recover. To do that, you had this environment, and then you had a regimen so that their days were completely predictable. So they were gotten up in the morning, they were sent to breakfast while the maids made their bed, they came back, there was an activity. For men, they would take men, and if the weather was acceptable, they would take them outside and have them do light farming, for example. The idea was to keep these people busy, all right? Take them off their trouble, take their mind off their troubles. The women, predictable, sewing, knitting, spinning, weaving, whatever. What also you need to know about these hospitals is they were incredibly impressive architectural structures. They were huge. So you have to imagine people like the people from Hillsborough who will go to the one in Virginia, as I will talk about, and the one in Raleigh. These buildings are 3 stories high with huge wings. They were given the time, they were very luxurious. I mean, this was not a bad place to be in terms of just your environment. So you were fed, you were taken care of, you lived in this very large building. But let me point out also that since people didn't live in large buildings in the early 19th century, you can only imagine what it would have been like to go from a small house in a small town like Hillsborough and being driven up the driveway to this huge, imposing building where you knew you were going to be incarcerated if you were conscious at all. So just the intimidation factor of the architecture is very interesting. Okay, so that's kind of the background. So when I'm talking about these women, I want you to think about the context in which I just described to you. I want you to think about them in this context. I want you to think about the doctor's attitudes towards them. I want you to think about their families' attitudes towards them, how helpless the families felt when their loved ones were essentially not functioning properly. So that's the context. Now I've got 5 women, one of which I know nothing about at all. One of them was Mary Witherspoon. I discovered her in March. And as you all know, in March, there were no libraries and no archives open. So I have all the citations I need to get to UNC, but until I can't tell you very much about Mary Witherspoon, except that she was the daughter of John Knox Witherspoon. She lived just south of town on a plantation across the river. And she was considered mentally ill by her family. So I've got a few references to that, which is why I discovered her. But I can't tell you any more about her until the library's open. So we'll leave her for the moment. And we're going to start with Anna Cameron Kirkland. Okay, Anna Kirkland was born in 1817. And she suffered from an inferiority complex. Now we know that because she later in life, she wrote to people saying, I know I'm not as pretty as my sisters, or I know I'm not as smart as people in my family. So she comes to her problem already feeling inferior to everybody else. Second thing that happened to her is that in one of the letters, it says she suffered from brain fever. Now, brain fever was the term that was given to a disease that's something like scarlet fever. You have a high temperature, and they treated it heroically. So she would have been bled, blistered, and purged. And the result of that treatment, apparently, she emerged from that as sort of permanently ill health. And she never quite recovered from the treatment, either the disease or the treatment that she received. So that's kind of a second contributing factor to what's going to happen to her later. At the age of 17 in 1835, she marries Alexander Cameron Kirkland, whose father owned Airmont. He was 10 years older than she was. He was apparently drank a lot. He apparently was at least psychologically abusive to her, and he failed as a businessman. So he was not the provider that an idealistic young 17-year-old might have expected. She had 2 children within 2 years with each other, 1836 and 1838. Her second son was a very large baby. Her husband was huge. So her second son was a very large baby, and apparently she had a difficult delivery. And so she suffered permanently from gynecological problems. Now remember, doctors, what doctors are thinking here, okay? They're not looking at these things, but that's her condition, basically. Her husband, Alexander, as I said, was not a particularly good provider, and eventually he becomes an alcoholic. And then he gets sick, and Edmund Stredwick, which was one of the very well-trained doctors here in Hillsborough, was his doctor. And he noted that he was sick, but he didn't expect him to die. And so Anna was taking care of him, and apparently, you can imagine she's nursing this sick husband. She has 2 kids, and she needs to leave the room just to get a little respite from her duties. And while she was gone, he died. Well, she had promised him that she would be with him if anything bad happened. I mean, they obviously had discussed this. And so she feels enormously guilty. The doctor didn't expect him to die. There was no reason for her not to leave the room. So she's feeling enormously guilty. And she simply couldn't accept the fact that God had taken him from her. And this ran into a problem because she was a devout Christian. And so when she rejects God, that means there's something definitely wrong with her relationship with God. And she writes, later on, in my heart, I almost cursed my God. So she's distraught on at least 2 levels. She began to show symptoms of what her family defined as mental illness. She couldn't sleep. She wouldn't eat. She tore at her hands, so her hands were raw, and she prayed incessantly. All right, so if you go into her room, she wouldn't accept food, she wouldn't accept water, she couldn't sleep, she was on the floor, on her knees, she was praying, and she wouldn't stop. A cousin visited Anna just after Christmas in 1845 and wrote to another relative that she seemed to be the most wretched, miserable creature I ever beheld. To use her own strong language, she thinks she is a lost, damned being for all eternity. She has lost all interest in her children and friends. Her poor mother is overwhelmed with trouble. She looks as if her mind, too, is unbalanced. Something needs to be done at once, or she will soon become a maniac. All right, so what do? You're a family, you've got this woman that is completely out of control. You don't know what to do for her. So you call 2 kinds of people. You call the minister and you call the doctor, all right? So they call on Robert Burwell, who was the Presbyterian minister. And Anna Burwell talks about him going over to see Anna Kirkland and talk to her about this religious compulsion that she has. And his assessment was, don't talk to her about religion. That, of course, was not helpful. So they called, and her brother, William, was a doctor. And interestingly enough, all of these women had doctors in their families. So her brother, William, was a doctor. He, of course, had no training in mental illness, nor did any other doctor in Hillsborough. So he wasn't really very helpful. They finally got desperate, and they had one really rich relative whose name was Duncan Cameron, largest landowner and slave owner in North Carolina. And of course, that she was related to him. Her mother was Duncan's sister. So mom writes to her brother and says, I'm fit to be tied. I don't know what else to do. What do you suggest? So Duncan comes to town and he takes a look at Anna and he decides something definitely needs to be done. So he makes arrangements. He writes to the Western Insane Asylum in Staunton, Virginia, and makes arrangements for Anna to be committed to the insane asylum. It had opened in 1825. It was one of these huge, gigantic, it's in the mountains, it's a beautiful setting, huge, gigantic buildings. It was more or less a private hospital, accepted paying patients. Remember that Stribling expects people to get well. It's not like before. He expects he expects himself to be able to cure her. She was admitted as patient 105 on February the 8th, 1846. The man who was her doctor is named Francis Stribling. He was among the leading, he's not a psychiatrist because they didn't have that, but he was one of the leading mental health experts in the United States. Very young. He visited her every day. He wrote letters, very detailed letters, which we have, back to her family, saying how she was doing, and giving an update on her condition. So one of the first letters he writes, he says, she was really distracted by being here. No kidding. She had trouble adjusting. She wouldn't sleep, she wouldn't eat, she prayed incessantly, whatever. And so he writes that, and then he wants to say something a little bit better a few weeks later. But what he writes is that she's obsessed with morbid reflections. She places herself on her hands and knees on the floor, insisting that she is unworthy of the comforts furnished her, as in a bed, and forces her nails into her thumb, saying self-torture was a duty. So what did he do to calm her down? Opium. Opium will calm you down, apparently. I've never tried it. But it did, apparently. And so he keeps writing to his family. But Anna, by this time, can write letters because she's calmed down. And so she writes to Duncan, her uncle, who has sent her there. I understand that patients sometimes blame their friends for bringing them here, but I have no feeling of the kind. On the contrary, shall forever bless the day that brought me to this house of refuge. So she's happy to be there. And one could imagine, not only does she feel guilty about her husband, not only does she have this mania about God, but she also is aware that her family has suffered. I mean, she was with her mother, who was going crazy trying to take care of her. And so she has guilt about that too. So now she's removed from them, and she's someplace that she knows that they care about her, they're being paid to take care of her. And so in some ways, one could guess that it's a relief to her. All right, so she's released only after a few months in November 1846. She comes back home, and what she of course faces is the fact that she has no way to support herself. Her husband's dead. He was a ne'er-do-well, so he left her no property. And she has to figure out a way to support herself. Well, she tries to teach school, and no students came. Her mother has property right up the street from Burwell School, actually. And so she's living with her mother. She's got these two small children. She tries to distract herself by being a do-gooder, by attending to the sick and raising money for the poor and all that kind of thing. And it's not really working very well. And she becomes very distraught about her financial situation, which of course makes her mental condition even worse. So on Christmas Day, 1849, her mother wrote to Duncan Cameron that Anna had been delirious for a month. She was convinced she was dying of cancer, and she, quote, raves day and night that she is lost and doomed to eternal suffering. She was convinced that she was about to commit acts of violence and that her children would be publicly executed. Her brother wrote to Duncan at the same time that he was treating her with opium. All right, Duncan says, back to the hospital. So she's taken back to Staunton, Virginia, where she is committed. And by the time she gets there, she was committed in 1870. By the time she gets there, she's addicted to opium. I mean, it's one of the. So what did they do to treat her? Opium, morphine, both of which cause constipation. And so then they gave their patients what they call little blue pills, which is to loosen the bowels so they didn't have constipation. Blistering and cold plunging baths. That's how she's being treated. Within weeks of Anna's return to Stanton, one of her neighbors shows up. Her name is Annabella Norwood, and she was admitted just a few weeks after Anna returned to Stanton. She was born in 1805. She was married to John Wall Norwood, a lawyer, in 1826, and she bore 8 children. Her problem was ill health. She had neuralgia, extremely painful, indigestion, extremely uncomfortable, and rheumatism, extremely painful. So this is a woman in pain. She originally sought treatment from a doctor in Buffalo. That apparently didn't work. And so she went to a doctor who specialized in women's diseases. Remember, there is no gynecology, but he specializes in women's diseases. And in Philadelphia, his name was Hodges. She went to him once, he sent her home, and then she was in such bad shape that she went back again. And she was in such bad shape that in one of the letters that her daughter wrote, she says that they had to take her from North Carolina to Philadelphia, laying on a feather bed. She couldn't be moved. She was so much in pain. Some in her family thought she was malingering and said she commonly divests herself of cares and anxieties of home by leaving it. So again, taking women seriously. They were not about to give into this. Her daughter Belle wrote, "If you were to witness the scenes of suffering, you would not wonder. Her uncle had visited Annabella. He said he had seen and thought he had heard of real pain, but never realized anything like this. He almost fainted and had to be taken out of Ma's room." So this is a woman who's really suffering. Her ill health, not surprisingly, caused her to be depressed. So she was admitted to Western State Asylum in Stanton, Virginia in April 1850. Anna and Annabella were released on the same day and came home together in July of 1851. Annabella remained in ill health for the rest of her life, but it was a long life. She didn't die until 1876. So she suffered a long life. Anna's affliction returned when she was home. She was so concerned to go back to a hospital that she realized that she couldn't afford to go back to Stanton because it was a paid hospital. She needed to go to the new hospital being built in Raleigh. So she sold her property. She had the court declare her incompetent. We've got the court records. She had her property sold, and she returned to the hospital in Raleigh in March 1856. Okay, hospital in Raleigh looks pretty much like the hospital in Stanton, and the doctor who was going to treat her had trained under Stribling. So she knew him. When she went to that hospital, she knew exactly who her doctor was going to be. She was patient number 2, brand new hospital. And she was diagnosed with mania caused by domestic troubles. So anyway, she was contented. She wrote, "I am satisfied that under the existing circumstances, I am as comfortable and happy here as I could be anywhere." 2 years later, another of her neighbors joined her, this time, of course, in Raleigh, Henrietta Webb. Now, I know very little actually about Henrietta Webb. I've got the hospital documents, so I know when she was committed and that kind of thing. I know the diagnosis, but I don't have any good juicy letters to share with you. Okay, so Henrietta Webb was born in 1830. She was one of 10 children. She was the daughter of Alexander Smith Webb. She went here to the Burwell School with 2 of her sisters, and the family eventually moved to Oaks, which is where the Binghams, who were headmasters of schools here, eventually ended up. Oaks is west of Chapel Hill, south of Hillsborough, on the way to Greensboro, actually the back road to Greensboro. She was released after 5 months. Remember, these people are thinking that they're looking for a cure, right? So if you get better, then that means they're successful. Not being cured is an affront, right? So it's an insult to the doctor's efforts. If they think you're better, they release you, that means they can claim a success. But she did not do well. One of the letters that I did find said she was full of notions, whatever that means, didn't eat and didn't sleep. So she was readmitted in 1861. She was released again in 1862, recommitted 3 months later, diagnosed with, this time, she was diagnosed with melancholia the first time, so depression. This time she's diagnosed with mania, so you can imagine she was treated with opium. And she was released 3 years later, but recommitted the next year in 1866 and diagnosed as an imbecile. So she's a complete failure from the doctor's point of view. She remained in the hospital until she was released into the custody of her brother-in-law, who took her home in 1882. She was in the hospital for a really long time. She died less than a month later at the age of 51. She never married, obviously. So this would have been, you can see how angry the doctors are getting. It goes from being sad to being manic to being an imbecile. She's hopeless. She's going to be here forever. And of course she was. The 4th woman's name is Sophia Deborah Turner. Now, Sophia was the daughter of a very, very rich planter in Halifax County, North Carolina. She was born in 1833. Her father had 3 plantations. And apparently that part of the state was very unhealthy. And so the Devereux family would come to Hillsborough in the summertime for a more healthy climate. And it was on those trips, it appears that it's one of those trips where she met Josiah Turner Jr. Now, Josiah Turner Sr. was a prominent man in Hillsborough. He had been the sheriff, he was a property owner, etc. And this is his son. He was older than she was, and so he'd had a career as a planter, a politician, long before he met her. And so they married in 1856, and he stayed home for 2 years. This is going to be a story of husband neglect rather than husband abuse, but he stayed home for 2 years and then resumed his political career, which of course took him to Raleigh or Washington or wherever. So he is literally never home while she bears 8 children. All right. The property is just north of Hillsborough. So you could have walked into Hillsborough. So she's not in town, but she's outside of town. She has 8 children. They're slave owners, so she had some domestic help. But he was in and out and his personality was, he was nasty, he was sarcastic, he was vicious, he was a very, very unpleasant man. And her sister wrote scathing comments about him, dismissing him as someone you didn't ever need to pay any attention to, as a man of huge ego. Apparently he did not support secession and did not support North Carolina's decision to secede from the Union. But because you had been considered, lacking in the proper bravery, if you did not sign up for the Confederate Army, he signed up as a private, and his Deborah relatives just laughed about it because they knew he didn't support the war, and here he was having to be a private in the Confederate Army. He was wounded, sent home. She was having yet another baby, and so she had to take care of a wounded husband and another baby. And then he decided he was going to run for the Confederate Congress. He was going to be a representative from North Carolina to the Confederate Congress in Richmond. And so he won that, and he went down to Richmond to oppose Jefferson Davis and oppose the war. And his fellow colleagues thought of him as, quote unquote, the lunatic fringe. Okay, this gives you some idea what this guy was like. Okay, he comes back home, and he is absolutely opposed to Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction. He is absolutely supports the Ku Klux Klan. He absolutely opposes the Republican governor and will do anything he can to undermine Republican efforts to reform or reconstruct North Carolina. So he buys a newspaper in Raleigh, and his editorials are used, the descriptors that I've used to describe. He's nasty, he's sarcastic, he's really a piece of work. But of course, that means he's not here. He's working in Raleigh. All right. Sometime in the late 1860s, during this period of time where he's writing his newspaper, editing his newspaper, in the late 1860s or the 1870s, Sophia becomes addicted to morphine. We have no idea why. There are all kinds of possible reasons. She had 8 children. She could easily have had gynecological problems. She was left alone all the time with 8 children. She could easily have been depressed. All kinds of reasons why she might have turned to a readily available substance to make her feel better. But in 1871, Josiah is deeply concerned about his wife. I am mortified past all measure that I am not willing to talk or write about a matter that I brood over day and night. There is no remedy for my sorrow. But in your disuse of, this is a letter to her, your disuse of, and he can't even write the name. He puts a long slash there, like I can't even say the name of what you're doing. God never made to respect the user of it, and I cannot. As soon as I am satisfied there is a disuse of it, our present relations shall be changed, and not until then. I would not, if I could, attempt to portray my deep felt mortification, which weighs upon me morning, noon, and night. So this is about him. He's mortified, not about her. By 1878, there was a crisis. He writes to her brother, I am unwilling the world should know what a place of torture and torment my house has been made to my children and myself these many years. So this is she was home for a long time. I must find some place for Sophia other than my house. I am sure neither God nor society require that I should longer tolerate and suffer, nor will I attempt to say how much agony and anguish this announcement creates. So unwilling to live with her, he told her that he was leaving and he was taking their 9-year-old daughter with him, unless she agreed to be committed to the asylum in Raleigh. So she agreed. And what's really special about the papers that I found having to do with Sophia is that she wrote poetry while she was committed, while she was a patient at the hospital. So what I'd like to do with you is to share the first poem she wrote just after she was committed to the insane asylum. It's called Insanity, and it was written in March 1878. Oh, say, is there a grief any greater than to feel your minds giving way? Or can there be a cross any heavier than for reason to yield up its sway? To feel that your thoughts are all floating away from your grasp one by one, never stopping a prayer to mutter, not even thy will be done. To feel that your friends are all thinking 'twere better for you to have died before the dark cloud came upon you and reason resigned her pride. I hope I humbly will bear whatever is sent from above, for I know whatever he doeth it all for love. But I pray, O Father of mercy, O spare me from bearing that cross, for I fear that if reason should leave me, my soul will sink under its loss. That's incredibly poignant. I mean, it's good poetry, yeah. And so that's what she was feeling when he took her to the hospital and left her there. She remained in that hospital for 2 years. She was not really cut off from the outside world. The minister's wife here in Hillsborough wrote to her children. We have her children's letters. They're full of childish things. Her little daughter writes that she got new dresses and that she planted a garden, but the pig dug it up. You know, just really very sweet, very cheerful, we hope we want you to get well soon. She wrote to her sons, who were older than this 9-year-old daughter. She wrote to her sons and begged to come home. And they said, you know, it's up to your doctor. When he tells us you can come home, you can come home. The saddest thing is that once Josiah left her at the door of the hospital, he neither wrote to her nor did he ever visit her. So I've got another poem that I want to read to you that talks about how she feels about that. She feels completely abandoned by this man that she clearly loved and continues to love. And she doesn't understand why he's abandoned her. So I'll read that poem in a minute, but since she's addicted to morphine, clearly giving her opium is not going to be good treatment. They probably did give her opium, but she writes about another treatment, which was kind of a deprivation therapy. Since she was so religious, they decided to deprive her of the sacraments until she gave up the morphine. So she writes about that, how again, her husband has left her. Now she doesn't even have the comfort of the church. And she writes that she's trying really hard to give it up, but she just can't. And she's praying, but the prayers aren't going anywhere, and she's just desperate. Apparently they found either she got better and gave up the morphine, or they relented and let her take the sacraments again. But that was the kind of thing that they were using on her. I'm going to read this second poem. I want to read two more poems. This one is called "I Am Leaving." It was written in 1878, and she thinks she's about to get out. All right, and so it's a very pleasant poem about, you know, who she's been dealing with and how she feels about this whole thing. And she says, I'm leaving my grated window where I stay the long day, and sorrow and grief for my children who are so far away. I am leaving the grand old master, that would have been the doctor, okay, whose patience will never cease, though trying to make a woman be quiet and hold her peace. Okay, now that's important because it means that if you stay in a mental hospital and behave yourself, you're all right, but do not cause any trouble. So he has taught her, keep her mouth, if she's unhappy about something, keep your mouth shut. I am leaving master propriety, though formal he may be. That was probably the steward. There's not a thing in the whole house his bright black eyes don't see. Then there is some poor old daddy who sometimes, though through will stray, escorting a tiresome visitor and showing them all the way. Other thing you need to know about insane asylums is that they were sources of entertainment for the community. So, and this started in the 18th century. If you go there's an 18th century insane asylum. Benjamin Rush, and you know who he is, he's a foremost doctor of the 18th century in the United States, was participated in its development, et cetera. And there is a pit, literally a pit, with a big wall around it, it's circular. And the pedestrians stood at top of the pit to watch the patients exercise in the pit. Every major mental hospital in the early 19th century United States had visitor day, usually on the weekends, in which people would simply come and walk, depending where they were coming from, or in buggies, and they would walk through the insane asylums and walk through the halls and look at the crazy people. All right, so that's what she's referring to. And then there is the matron who daily takes her walk, though sometimes we could everyone see she was hardly able to talk. Then too, I'm leaving behind me our little Mrs. Jones, who if she does not mind her cards, will soon be skin and bones. And then there is little Molly, who goes sailing through the house as fast as any partridge, but not as still as a mouse. I shall miss my dear little Molly to bring me my quarterly dram, that would be her medication. She never gave me a cross word, no matter how grum I am. I can never forget good Clara, who has never let me see that she ever thought it trouble to worry to wait on me. I mean, these people had servants. And then there's the two Miss Marthas, Mrs. Roger, Miss Cole, Miss York, Alice, and Jenny. And I looked them up in the census. They're all listed as hospital staff. Their greeting, I'll miss when we go for a walk. I'm leaving the tender, watchful care that used to fret me so, for it made me feel as if they thought I did not have the sense to go. It almost broke my heart to come where I thought the devil to pay. But now I think if a woman behaves, she will never regret her stay. Then indeed, I used to think that I'd got to a hell upon earth. But now I see if the trial be made, it will surely bring its worth. And I can never forget the kindness and the tender, watchful care. It was all that kept me hopeful, so my trial I could bear. And the names of all whom I've mentioned shall mingle in my prayers, that the Father of all will bless them no matter where they are. So, I mean, this is a very positive, of course she thinks she's leaving, so anyway. Okay, and one last poem I would like to read is a poem about the fate of wife and mother. And this is where she talks, she writes more than one of these, but this is the one where she's writing about her husband's abandonment. A woman once was lying upon a lowly bed, the mother of 8 children, 3 of them are dead. And as she lay, she whispered to a kind friend sitting near, tell me where are the loved ones that should be standing here? The one who took me long ago, a young and happy bride, who took me from my sister's arms and from my father's side, who swore he would comfort, protect, and cherish me and shield me from the bitter storms that drift across life's sea. Take a message to him from me, whom he once loved as his life, while now I am nothing save his poor forgotten wife. Tell him to watch my 4 great boys, now I am gone away, and to guard my daughter's honor, lest from virtue's path she stray. Tell him 'tis the my life, for ere the sun be risen, my body shall be out of pain, my soul be out of prison. Tell him I dreamt I stood with him and saw the yellow sunlight shine, on a happy home that once was his and mine. And as we looked, a cloud came drifting o'er the blue, and down the rain came pattering, and heaven was hid from view. But he said, my love, avert sorrow, we must have storms in life, but we'll fight life's battle bravely, my own dear little wife. And when life's battle's over, we'll sink into one grave, and our spirits shall still united, shall we turn to him who gave. I fought life's battle bravely, but now my work is done, and I must sink into that grave and lie there all alone. The kind friend o'er her bending found the breath of life had fled, and the mother of those children in another home lay dead. And he, underlined, he was wandering o'er the world in search of other joys, and the last thing he thought about was the mother of those boys. So that's how she was feeling about, his abandonment. All right, she was released after 2 years. She was released in 1880, and she died 2 weeks later. Anna Kirkland was still there. She died in the hospital 10 years later in 1890, and she's buried in Airmount. So what we've got are 4 case studies. And what conclusions can we draw from these 4 case studies? Number 1, women's mental illness wasn't necessarily all mental. I mean, every one of these women had, a condition that could easily cause them to be depressed, if nothing else, all right? That religion played a really big role in their ability to deal with, or not, the fact that they were separated from their family, that they were under treatment, and that they probably weren't getting better, even though it's important for the doctors to believe they were getting better. The degree to which having such a person in your household was a real crisis for a family. I mean, these people would not, under normal circumstances, had taken their relatives somewhere else. I mean, the way mental illness was usually taken care of was in the home. These people were, of course, exceptional. They were all well-to-do, prominent, had resources. Duncan Cameron could pay for his niece to go all the way to Virginia to get her out of the house. So these are women who are privileged. One can only imagine the conditions that less privileged women had to put up with when they did not abide by the usual expectations of what a woman should be doing and thinking and acting. So those are the kinds of things that I hope you got out of this, and I'll be really happy to take any questions, and Carrie's going to monitor this, so,
yes.
So she'll ask the questions and I'll try my best to answer them.
So the way we're going to do questions is if you guys will raise your hands, and the way you raise your hand is, I believe, sorry, we're having a few, gotta love Zoom and technical difficulties. There should be a control down at the bottom of your screen, and if you raise your hand, we will allow you to talk, and you can ask your question to Sylvia directly. So we're going to keep an eye on that, and while that happens, I actually have a question.
We're excited to try.
So you talked about how these were well-to-do women. These were people that were able to pay. Annabella Norwood, of course, they would have had to pay for her care as well and going away. So how much, do we have any idea how much they had to pay? Was it a sliding scale? Were there rates? What were we talking about in terms of the cost?
I have absolutely no idea.
I'm sorry to ask that.
No idea. What's interesting about mental asylum records is that they are not necessarily accessible. In fact, the only reason I have any information on what became Dorothea Dix is because the state legislature just freed up those documents to 1918. Since I'm interested in the 19th century, that was perfect. But if you're interested in 1920, they're still sealed. So it's really hard to get those documents. The only reason I know anything about the medical treatment as opposed to the deprivation treatment at the Virginia Asylum is because those records are open. And so I've got, how they, you can barely read them. Doctors back then not having any better penmanship than they do now. But if you're kind of familiar with what they were probably using, you can make it out. But I don't have those medical records for Dorothea Dix.
Okay.
I don't know if they're open. And again, even if they were, I couldn't get to them because everything's closed.
And was that hospital different than this Western Insane Asylum in the sense that it was the North Carolina hospital? Was it subsidized and all that?
Yeah, yeah. One of the questions I haven't answered and probably won't be able to, remember I said that she sold all of her property?
Right.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I have no way of knowing whether she sold her property so she could get in right away. She would have the money to pay to get in right away, because this hospital, the North Carolina hospital, was for indigent, people who couldn't afford. So the way you got into that hospital, not her way, but the other usual way, was that a local official would designate you incompetent or crazy or mad or whatever term they used. And counties were allowed to send people to the state hospital. It was free. I mean, it was a state hospital.
Right.
So I'm not quite sure what all this selling her property. I've got all the documents that show that she did it. She was declared incompetent first by the court, and then a trustee was appointed, and he sold the property. And so one way of saying that, she might have given the money to her son, saying that I have no money, and therefore, so I don't know that little piece of information between her selling the property and her going to the hospital. I don't have that piece of information. So there are all kinds of possibilities.
Great. Do we have a hand raised? We have a hand raised here. Elizabeth, we're going to allow you to talk. So you can go ahead and ask your question. Gotta love technology, everybody. We're so thankful for it. And yet. Okay, well, while we're waiting, Elizabeth, we're definitely going to try to get to you. We're dealing with the technology here. I just want to clarify, would they have been able to leave themselves?
Mm-mm.
I mean, they had to be released by their doctors. Yeah. Would families have been able to request their release against doctor's orders? Interesting question.
The only insight I have into that was a letter at the very end of Sophia's sojourn, where she's desperate to get out, and she's written her husband, and she never gets a letter from him. Her sons write on behalf of their father, all right? And one of the sons said something that was very puzzling. I'm not sure what it meant. And he said, well, if we give the hospital $500 bond, we can make 10% on it. And essentially what it sounds like is that the family would, if they did that, they would be releasing the hospital of any responsibility. And the hospital would keep it and give them interest on the money. It's like a bond.
Wow.
But I just had this one reference. So I'm assuming that's what it meant.
Interesting. Steve, you have a question. Go ahead and unmute and ask it.
Hello, Sylvia.
Hi.
Hey, thinking a great topic and wonderful research you've done. Sad stuff though. Thinking about Anna Kirkland and Alexander Kirkland, did white women compartmentalize the philandering and infidelity, the sexual abuse and rape of slaves? And I'm thinking in particular about Elizabeth Keckley, and which would have gone on after her birth in 1838 of the child, where she had obviously some issues with the birth, and it wasn't long after that Alexander Kirkland would have had a child by Elizabeth Keckley, who he has serially raped, I think, during that time. But obviously that was something that was done in the community. I'm wondering how that might have contributed to her instability. And did white women in general compartmentalize those infidelities?
Okay, and I'm going to summarize your question, Steve, so that everyone can hear it with the mic. His question was, did white women compartmentalize their husband's philandering, particularly in the case of Anna Kirkland with her husband, Alexander Kirkland, who had a relationship with an enslaved woman who would go on to become Elizabeth Keckley? And how did that impact her mental state?
Well, of course, we have no idea how it affected her mental state, but the answer to the first part of the question is, apparently, there's this absolutely famous quote that I just was looking at yesterday. I wish I typed it out, from a Civil War diarist, famous Civil War diarist named Mary Boykin Chestnut. Her husband was an advisor to Jefferson Davis during the war. And she writes, our husbands live in the same house with their wives and their concubines. And every woman on a plantation knows who the father of all the mulatto children are on everyone else's plantation but hers. Those, she says, seem to have dropped from the clouds.
Interesting.
So according to Mary Boykin Chestnut, it was, the issue was there was nothing a woman could do about it. Divorce was impossible. She could respond in any number of ways. She could make her husband's life miserable, but when you make a husband's life miserable in the South in the 19th century, you're making yourself miserable. She could abuse the slave. She could abuse the children. She could insist that all of them be sold. So there were various things that she could do, which of course is not really compartmentalizing because she's acknowledging that this exists. I mean, Southern women knew that this was going on all the time. We have examples here in Hillsborough. So it's not like, I mean, you have to be blind not to acknowledge that the presence of mulattoes means that white men are having sex with black women, and to some extent, vice versa. So interracial sex is taking place, and you'd have to be blind not to acknowledge that. So.
One more question. We're getting close to 4 p.m. So if you have any more questions, go ahead and raise your hand now. If you think of questions afterwards, you can email those questions to director@burwellschool.org, and we'll do our best to try to help address those. It looks like we have one more question from Linda. Linda, can you unmute?
Yes. Wouldn't it be more appropriate to say interracial rape than sex, which in my mind implies consent?
She asked if it would be more appropriate to say interracial rape than sex, because saying sex implies consent, and the issue being that for many of these women, they were not consenting partners in that intercourse.
For those women, yes, interracial rape would be absolutely appropriate. But we do know that there were women who partnered with, and vice versa,
right,
in which case that would be interracial sex. But yes, absolutely.
Yes. And I think that would likely be the case of Elizabeth Keckley. We would
Definitely.
say interracial rape.
Yeah, yes, yes, definitely.
Thank you, Linda. Elizabeth,
Thank you.
I'd love to give you one more opportunity if you have a question. Well, you can send that to us. And then just one last question. You mentioned Edmund Stredwick, who was, of course, a very prominent doctor here in Hillsborough at the time. And he is also very connected to what would become Dorothea Dix. Mm-hmm. Do we know if Edmund Stredwick had any connection to the decision to send these women, or was part of that process?
No, we don't know.
Okay.
And yes, he was really prominent in the planning of Dorothea Dix. They wanted him to be the first superintendent, and he declined. So it was Fisher that became the first superintendent. But he was he knew a lot about the building of these asylums. I mean, the one in Raleigh had a heating system, had a gas lighting system. I mean, it was really on the forefront of, every patient had their own room. So, I mean, this was not like I described in the early, in Williamsburg, well, of course they had their own room too, but, but I mean, it was, the idea was to make them as physically comfortable as possible so that and as busy as possible. So they have a very regimented schedule. You do this at the bells rang, and that meant you went to lunch, or the bells rang, that means you went to choir practice. So bells rang, that meant you went to sewing class, or whatever, or now it's letter writing time, or whatever it is. So we don't, I need to add that just about the turn of the century, or just about the mid-century, began to appear protests from women who had been incarcerated by their husbands for what they considered to be no good reason. It was get rid of the wife and put her in an insane asylum. And there is a whole literature on that. Basically what they were trying to do is to change the law so that women had more recourse when someone was trying to commit them. So it's a legal reform movement, but there are dozens of books, exposés, as lurid as you could possibly imagine, from these women who are trying to get attention from lawmakers to say, a husband should not be able to commit his wife just because he wants to get rid of her. So, things are changing rapidly during the 19th century, and these hospitals were built. Now, of course, after the Civil War, things begin to deteriorate. The state of North Carolina didn't have much money. The Yankees have camped on their property, have torn down all the fences that kept them away from the casual visitors who came on Sundays. And they've torn down all the trees. They cut down all the trees because they needed to build fires. They've raided the garden. They've taken all their stock, their livestock. So these had originally been self-sufficient. They were little communities, and it was very difficult after the Civil War. The state of North Carolina, under the Republicans, allowed blacks to come, and white North Carolinians were not about to have that, so they segregated the hospital so that what had been a relatively roomy place was now segregated because they had two populations they needed to take care of. And of course, the state of North Carolina was poor after the Civil War, so the kind of money that they might have expected. And by the time Sophia goes into the insane asylum, those doctors knew that they had chronic inmates, that these people were never going to get out. So all this optimism that occurred during the first part of the 19th century is pretty much dissipated by the 1870s and 1880s. Those people are never going to leave. And so they have to care for them. So that's what was sort of going on during that time. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sylvia.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
for sharing all of this today. Yes, yay, from our small group
It was a
here.
pleasure.
We thank everyone for joining us today, and we do ask that you continue to follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram. Go to our website. That'll let you know about all of our upcoming events. And we will be sending out a PDF after the event with some photographs of these women that Sylvia talked about, those that we have, and a little more information. And we do welcome, if you have questions, please email us. And once again, thanks for your support of the Burwell School. And Sylvia, thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thanks.